Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria have launched over 170 attacks on American service members who are stationed in the Middle East to ensure the defeat of ISIS. And for the first time, Iran launched a direct massive missile and drone attack on Israel and is threatening to attack Israel again. Iran is not deterred. Hezbollah is not deterred. The Houthis are not deterred. Hamas is not deterred. The militias in Iraq and Syria are not deterred. The Biden-Harris administration has not punished any of these terrorists for their violence. The administration's policy to attempt to de-escalation puts America on the defensive. We are focused on blocking and tackling when we should be on the offensive, squeezing our adversaries where it hurts. The result is weakness and vulnerability for the United States and our allies. We urgently need to change course. Just last week, after waiting 5 months, the president finally took a necessary step toward implementing the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, excuse me, that Congress enacted in April. This law contains a wide range of sanctions sanctions authorities to counter international financing of Hamas, to counter Iran's missile and drone program, to counter China's purchase of Iranian oil, and to hold the Iranian regime accountable for its brutal human rights abuses against its own people. The administration needs to comply with the law and fully implement these sanctions. Today, our witnesses will provide us with stark assessments of the entire Iran threat, including the nuclear program, missiles and drones, terrorism, human rights abuses, and assassination plots. Our witnesses will also tell us how we should change the administration's ineffective strategy to actually deal with these threats. Strongly worded statements are not cutting it. They're still lobbing drones, missiles, and rockets at our friends. We need a new plan, and we need it now. I now turn to the ranking member, my dear friend, Dean Phillips, for his opening statement.
I never thought I would get to say Chairman Burchett. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it probably won't ever happen again, I can tell you that. And I wanted to say something. I'm not cutting on your time, but I guess I am. But as chairman, hey, I hold the gavel. I can do that. Apparently, I had the wrong meeting room, so I went down and greeted the witnesses in another thing, and I'm sure they're all sitting there going, "Hey, you're not my chairman. Tim Burchett just came by and said he was my chairman." So anyway, and I didn't get to say hey to y'all. So hey, so here I am. Anyway, Dean, sorry, brother.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask for another minute at the end of my remarks.
You got it.
Greetings, especially to our witnesses, to my colleagues, to the wonderful staff that populate both sides of this committee aisle, and to those of you in attendance, staff members and people passionate about peace who might see this issue slightly differently, but I know that ultimately we are all aligned. And I also want to wish Joe Wilson, my friend, my colleague, a remarkable man, a speedy recovery. I can assure you that even after a health episode, the man can run circles around most of us, and we are thinking of him. As we approach the horrid anniversary of October 7th, the massacre in Israel, in which Hamas murdered 1,200 people, including young teenagers at a music festival, took 250 hostages, 101, we believe, still remain in Gaza today, and that includes American citizens. And I would ask that all of us be considerate of the fact that American citizens are being held by this terror organization in the tunnels of Gaza. It feels like the ground has shifted under our very feet, and the realities with which we're grappling with a year ago have morphed and expanded as the region now sits at the precipice. Well before October 7th, Iran has threatened U.S. national security interests and regional stability, in fact, since 1979. It has continued to advance its nuclear program, despite a June censure from the IAEA Board of Governors, and Secretary Blinken has also stated that Iran's nuclear breakout time is between 1 and 2 weeks. I'll say that again, between 1 and 2 weeks. While the election of President Pezeshkian provides an interesting opportunity to explore a diplomatic path forward with Iran, they are a nuclear threshold state, and allowing that is unacceptable. Iran has also increased cooperation with Russia on issues ranging from avoiding economic sanctions, obstructing accountability at the United Nations, and advancing military technology and weapons. Just last week, Secretary Blinken confirmed that Iran has indeed transferred ballistic missiles to Russia for use in its illegal and unjust war in Ukraine. This is an axis of evil. The burgeoning relationship is deeply concerning, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how the administration and Congress can best work together in a bipartisan fashion to ensure that our approach to Iran is coordinated to advance our strategic goals. The threat of Iran's so-called shadow war has come out into the open since its unprecedented direct attack on Israel on April 14th of this year, even as it continues to establish and enable proxies to attack U.S. personnel and Israel by air, land, and sea. Over the past year, we've witnessed the Houthis, the Iranian-backed terrorist organization in Yemen, attack military and commercial vessels in the Red Sea almost 200 times, threatening international trade and freedom of navigation. Hezbollah, too, has chosen to join the fray with an estimated 120 to 200,000 missiles and rockets in its arsenal to attack Israel and Israeli civilians. Hundreds of thousands of civilians on both sides of the Israel-Lebanon border have been displaced and cannot return home, cannot attend school, cannot live because of the continued violence. The United States is working diligently to de-escalate tension, reinforce Lebanon's sovereignty, and maintain emerging. Militants in the West Bank are linking up with Iran for weapons and funding in ways that we have not seen before. This is worrisome and threatens stability and security in the entire region. But these militants are not the only threats to stability and security. Leaders within the current Israeli coalition are withholding tax dollars due to the Palestinian Authority, delegitimizing its leadership, and emboldening extremist Israeli settlers attacking Palestinian civilians. Equally unacceptable. I'm pleased that the Biden administration issued an executive order which authorizes sanctions against any foreign person responsible for actions that threaten the peace, security, or stability in the West Bank. It is my hope and expectation that current sanctions are only the beginning of more serious measures to be taken against any of those who seek to escalate fear and violence against human beings in the area. President Biden, along with our Egyptian and Qatari partners, have been working diligently to bridge the remaining gaps and bring an immediate ceasefire in Gaza that would see the release of all remaining hostages and a surge of humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians. The third stage of the proposed plan is to begin major Gaza reconstruction. President Biden has rightfully stated that Hamas cannot and will not be able to govern Gaza following a ceasefire. That creates more questions. What would a governing authority look like? Who would be responsible for security? The answers to those questions require leaders across the region, including Israel, in particular Prime Minister Netanyahu, to set aside personal gain and act in the best interest of Israelis, Palestinians, and human beings around the world. Put plainly, without a ceasefire, without tangible steps towards a two-state solution, Israel loses and Iran wins. Today, I've laid out the serious threat that Iran and its proxies pose to the United States and Israel. But I also believe that the best way to counter Iran's malign behavior to fundamentally undermine its destructive mission is for Israel to deepen its cooperation with like-minded countries in the region, to normalize with Saudi Arabia, and to live side by side in peace and security with its Palestinian brothers and sisters. When I started my remarks, I said the Middle East was on the precipice, but the precipice of what? The Biden administration has successfully avoided a regional escalation since Hamas's attack on October 7th, but time is running out. The region could easily devolve into chaos with Israel and the US facing down adversaries on multiple fronts, or its leaders could choose a different path, a path that would leave Israel and the wider region in peace, in security, and stability. I hope and I indeed pray for the sake of Israel and for the region and for Palestinians that we choose partnership, that we choose hope, and that we choose peace. Lastly, I want to note that we have uncovered Iran's intention and success in manipulating and influencing our elections. It is appalling, it's reprehensible, and we must, and I know we will, work in a bipartisan fashion to counter these threats to democracy both here and around the world. With that, I yield back the balance of my time that I no longer have.
Thank you to Ranking Member Phillips, my co-chair, I guess. I'll be all right.
Oh, you just gave me a promotion.
Yeah, I did. I don't care. You don't get any more pay. We're also pleased to have our distinguished witnesses with us today, the Honorable Elliott Abrams. Thank you, brother. Former Deputy Assistant to the President, National Security Advisor. We also have Miss Kirsten Fontenrose. Did I get that right, ma'am? All right. You know, you got a doppelganger back in Knoxville, Tennessee. There's a lady I know. I went to school with her, and if you ever get in trouble, you say, oh, it wasn't me. It was Tim Burchett's friend back in Knoxville, Tennessee that did it. And you look very much like her. And I looked up and I thought, dadgum, what's she doing here? But obviously it's not her. And then you are the former senior director for the Gulf at the National Security Council. Did I get that right? All right. And now I'm going to massacre this poor lady's name. We welcome Miss Carrie Filipetti. I get it? Wow. Well, I'm Burchett. Nobody's ever gotten it right. So, yeah.
This should be easy.
Yeah, she's, wait, hang on. Let Jesse rob this train. Hang on. Executive Director of the Vandenberg Coalition. Finally, we have Mr. Jonathan Lord. I got that one right. All right. Thanks, brother. Give me some. Senior Fellow and Director for Middle East Security with the Center for a New American Security. I want to thank you all for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes, which my friend Dean Phillips did not follow, obviously, in order to allow time for members' questions. And I now recognize the Honorable Elliott Abrams for his opening statement. Thank you, brother, for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the invitation to testify today. The United States, Israel, and our allies face an increasingly complex terror network that allows Iran and its proxies to share expertise, coordinate activities, and collaborate on joint attacks. It has rightly been called Iran's proliferation of chaos. Iran's ability to disrupt peace and to help the countries most hostile to the U.S. does not end at the borders of the Middle East. As has been noted, just this month, the U.S. government informed us of Iran's shipment of hundreds of short-range ballistic missiles to Russia for use in attacking Ukraine. Those shipments are most significant for the Ukrainians. They will kill, but they should be a clear message to us about the nature of the Iranian regime. And all these activities are being conducted by an Iranian regime without nuclear weapons. What would they be doing if they had a nuclear umbrella and felt they could be even bolder? But the Iranian nuclear program continues to expand, and quickly. Mr. Chairman, like you, I do not believe the U.S. and our allies have responded adequately to Iran's actions. Consider the Houthis. The Houthis' impact on international trade and commerce. The Houthi attacks have reduced ships going through, cargo going through the Suez Canal by about 75 or 80%. A recent article by former Royal Navy Commander Tom Sharp was entitled, "The Houthis Have Defeated the U.S. Navy." The Houthis have defeated the U.S. Navy. They have not been deterred, as also has been noted, by the defensive actions the U.S. and allies have taken, which have failed. And the Houthis, now emboldened, have ramped up their attacks. Drones and cruise missiles are now accompanied by hijackings and ballistic missiles. The Houthis are not producing advanced ballistic and cruise missiles. Those are Iranian missiles given to the Houthis. So that interference with international shipping is a product of Iranian foreign policy. But Iran has paid no price for it. As to the sale of ballistic missiles to Russia, significant consequences were promised. That was the phrase. Where are they? Will Iran pay a price? Iran has paid no significant price for its April attack on Israel. Iran has paid no significant price thus far for its defiance of the International Atomic Energy Agency and its buildup of a stockpile, as noted, that would allow it to build several nuclear weapons in just a few weeks. Oil sanctions are on the books, but they're not really being enforced, and Iran is selling more and more oil. I don't think, Mr. Chairman, that should lead us to just wring our hands. I think it should lead us to act. We can prevent these activities because Iran's leaders are evil, but they are rational. They respond to actions that threaten their interests, and they respect American power. So what should be done? First, I think both candidates for the presidency should repeat what President Biden and his predecessors have said, that the United States will not permit Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Second, both CENTCOM and the U.S. Navy believe their ships our ships are sitting ducks for the Houthis and are dissatisfied with the way the U.S. has allowed Iran to close international waterways. CENTCOM Commander Eric Kurilla wrote in a classified letter that was reported in the press, U.S. service members will die if we continue going this way. And he argued for a more forceful response. We need that more forceful response. We need to make it clear to Iran that if an American ship is hit, the U.S. retaliation will be against Iran, not its expendable Houthis. Again, Iran's leaders are evil, but they are rational. I would like to close with one point. It's important to remember that Iranians have not chosen that regime, the regime that rules them. The Iranian people loathe that regime, and they repeatedly risk their lives to rise up against it. The ultimate solution to the problem of Iran is democracy. When the Iranian people are free to govern themselves, Iran will have a different government and a different foreign policy. So we should do all we reasonably can to help them bring that day nearer. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee.
Pushing that dadgum button. What am I paying you for? Thank you, Mr. Abrams. I now recognize Ms. Kirsten Fontenrose for her opening statement.
Chairman Burchett, Ranking Member Phillips, and esteemed members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about the accelerating threat to long-term U.S. interests posed by Iran and its armed underlings. For over a decade, CENTCOM has consistently described Iran as the primary destabilizing force in the Middle East. 10 years ago, when Secretary Austin was CENTCOM commander, he cited Iran's proxy networks and its support for terrorism as major challenges. Since then, Iran has throttled up these programs with the explicit goal of eradicating U.S. influence in and access to the Middle East. Despite the headlines, the peril from Iran is not rooted in Gaza. If the conflict ends tomorrow, Iran's foreign policy will continue to demand policymaker attention. We will still be confronted by the IRGC and their cohorts in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, by a nuclear program holding us in a state of paralysis, by missiles that are approaching hypersonic and drones that are as fast as cruise missiles, by arms sales that directly threaten Ukraine, a crippling of global of commerce, cyber warfare threatening the democratic process, and information warfare targeting the social cohesion of our communities. The only domain in which we are not in a low-simmer war with Iran right now is space, and that is likely temporary. Iran launched 4 satellites this year. Cozy relations with China and Russia could bring access to troubling space tools. Because of growth in their missile and drone programs, accelerated by the lapse of UN sanctions and provisions in UNSCR 2231 in 2020 and 2023, Iran is now able to deliver lethal effects to every country in the Middle East. They have ramped up their capabilities in terms of small arms, long-range missiles, attack drones. Next year, we'll unleash their nuclear program and its collaborative work with our adversaries if we do not trigger snapback. Should Iran cross the threshold of nuclear weaponization, the risk of deadly escalation in any exchange of missile fire between Iran and Israel will spike because of payload uncertainty. Barring intelligence to the contrary, any nuclear-capable missile fired from Iran would be assumed to carry a nuclear payload. To use an old-school Cold War term, the scenario is mutually assured destruction. In my written testimony, I offer thoughts on potential actions to address these accelerating risks, so let me briefly touch on 2. First, Congress can direct to draft an effort to draft a unified long-term strategy that will guide interagency planning beyond a single administration and inspire partners to get on board. In the absence of a strategy in the Gulf, of a strategy that will endure, let's say, for more than 3 years, partners like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and perhaps soon Bahrain, are backed into positions of vulnerability, walking back policies that economically and informationally isolated Iran and its vassals in the region. Ask CENTCOM how much harder the lack of such a strategy has made their work on integrated air and missile defense. The region and Europe are clamoring for this. The US cannot operate around the world without building coalitions, and we can't build coalitions without a plan. Coalition members can be incentivized by including countries in programs just out of the gate, like the Comprehensive Security Integration and Prosperity Agreement with Bahrain and the mill-to-mill and intel sharing benefits proposed in the Link and AI Accords Acts. Second, protecting freedom of navigation and global shipping lanes is a primary US national security objective as stated in our national security strategy and national defense strategy. It is quite literally the reason we have a Navy. And yet we are not authorizing our Navy to do it. The Houthis in Yemen are intransigent in political negotiations. They have learned from Iran that keeping the US in political talks, on the one hand, allows you to conduct acts of terrorism with full impunity on the other. To quote a senior Yemeni official in a conversation I had yesterday, there is an entire generation being mobilized and trained for holy wars. All 6 types of anti-ship ballistic missiles and 4 of the 6 types of cruise missiles used by the Houthis in attacking ships in the Red Sea are provided by Iran or fitted with Iranian guidance kits. What will DoD and Congress tell the American people when an Arleigh-class destroyer, Arleigh Burke-class destroyer with over 300 sailors on board bursts into flames hit by one of their missiles? Because we only allow DoD to catch fly balls and not to go to bat. In support of UNSCR 2624, which labels the Houthis as terrorists and reinforces the arms embargo, and acknowledging the defense of people and interests permitted by Article 51 of the UN Charter, it's time to mobilize partners to do more to interdict weapons, support local forces in Yemen to do more to challenge the Houthi position that enables their strikes, and here's where tables get flipped, pass an AUMF for limited scope, geographically and time-bound operations that defang the Iranian proxy most directly threatening US interests. What is at risk if we do not professionalize our approach to the regime in Iran? It is access to energy that will drive our economy for at least several decades, access to resources and alliances while we compete for economic and perhaps military primacy against multiple bully states increasingly aligned in the singular goal to unseat us, and access to shape the widening worldviews of countries that were so closed for so long. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I think you did that all without taking a breath. Pretty
High school
dadgum
debater,
good.
sir.
Say that again.
High school debate.
High school debate. Oh, okay. Right on. I now recognize Miss Carrie Filipetti for her opening statement. Ma'am.
Chairman Burchett, Ranking Member Phillips, distinguished members of this committee, I want to begin first by joining you in wishing for the continued recovery of Chairman Wilson, whose leadership of this committee has been instrumental in protecting American interests. It's my honor to testify today on the threat Iran poses to United States interests. While both the chairman and the ranking member have mentioned a key anniversary, that is the 1-year anniversary of the Iranian-backed October 7th terrorist attack in Israel, there are 2 other anniversaries that should frame our discussion today. The first is the 2-year anniversary of the Iranian regime's murder of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, as well as the 30-year anniversary of the Iranian-backed terrorist attack on a Jewish community center in Argentina that killed 85 people. Collectively, these 3 anniversaries demonstrate the reach of the Iranian threat, that of the regime itself against its own people, that of its proxies in the Middle East, and that of its proxies around the world. While my co-panelists have thus far done an exceptional job highlighting the regime's threat in the Middle East, I want to focus a little bit on a threat closer to home, that is, in Latin America and the Caribbean. Here, Iran is attempting to exploit both their growing presence in the region as well as an unprecedented border crisis to pose a direct threat to American security. The Iranian regime has long recognized the importance of gaining a foothold in our hemisphere from which to counter American influence and threaten American lives. Over the years, Iran has used this influence to radicalize populations, fund terrorist activities, and transfer weapons into the hands of authoritarian regimes or terrorist leaders. Iran pursues radicalization using a network of so-called cultural centers, embassies, and propaganda outlets. One key example is Al-Mustafa University, an Iranian-backed export agency for Islamist propaganda that is now in over 50 countries and which was sanctioned in 2020 for its active role in recruiting for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Outside of these formal programs, Iranian terrorists disguised as diplomats are deployed around the region to recruit for terrorist activities, including Mohsen Rabbani, the supposed Iranian cultural attaché to Argentina, who recruited for Hezbollah's 1994 Jewish Community Center attack I mentioned before. Finally, Iran uses Hispan TV, its regime-run Spanish-language media arm, to spread anti-American propaganda across the 17 countries in which it now operates. Iran also seeks to undermine the United States through weapons transfers with authoritarian regimes. Regular flights between Tehran and Caracas have been suspected of carrying either terrorists or arms shipments between the 2 nations. For example, earlier this year, the United States completed the forfeiture of a plane formerly owned by US-sanctioned Mahan Air and piloted by an ex-commander of the IRGC. There's public speculation that the plane may have been bringing weapons to conducting terror attacks in the region on the anniversary of that Jewish Community Center bombing. As the Department of Justice noted in a recent House Homeland Security Committee hearing, it's clear the Iranians are determined to carry out attacks in the United States, and it is further clear that Iran sees Latin America and the Caribbean as key in that effort. Fortunately, Congress has recognized this threat. It is thanks to Congress that Iran's threat in the Western Hemisphere specifically was made public through the passage of the Countering Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act of 2012. It is thanks to Congress in imposing comprehensive sanctions in 2012 that Iran was forced to the negotiating table around its nuclear program. And it is thanks to Congress that we have new authorities encountering Iran's malign influence around the world through this year's passage of the Massa Act, the Fight Crime Act, and the SHIP Act. But as important as Congress has been in countering Iran in the past, it will be equally significant going forward. So rather than just admire the problem, as my co-panelists have done as well, I'm going to offer a few recommendations. First, as Mr. Abrams noted, we must respond when American citizens or our allies are attacked. American assets have been targeted over 175 times since October 7th, 2023, which doesn't even include the 43 American citizens who were slaughtered by Hamas on that day alone. By contrast, we have only responded 11 times, despite historical evidence laid out in my written testimony that strength is the best deterrent against Iranian aggression. Second, we must encourage our European partners to trigger UN Resolution 2231 snapback provisions before their expiration in October of next year, or risk losing key capabilities in the fight against Iranian terrorism and nuclear weapons development. Third, we must demand executive branch compliance with existing Iran-related legislation. And fourth, we should make sure that we combine this maximum pressure campaign with maximum support for the Iranian people. More recommendations are laid out in my written testimony. I'm deeply grateful for the bipartisan commitment to protecting American lives from the Iranian threat shown by this Congress. Thank you for the opportunity to share both the severity of the threat and some proposed solutions. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Lord, you're recognized.
Chairman Burchett, Ranking Member Phillips, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. This is the second opportunity I have had to come before this august body as an expert witness, and it is my honor to do so, especially alongside such esteemed colleagues. First, allow me to express my best wishes to Chairman Wilson. My thoughts are with him and his family, and I pray he has a full and speedy recovery. Today's subject is challenging, both as a problem for policy and as an issue that carries great emotional weight. With respect to the complexity, nuances, and breadth of today's subject, I'd ask that my written testimony be made part of the record. As a policy, CNES does not take institutional positions, so my testimony today will reflect my personal positions and perspectives based on my professional experience. My testimony today will be guided by the spirit of comedy and bipartisanship that has long undergirded the critical work of this subcommittee. I firmly believe there has and continues to be a bipartisan through line in American foreign policy in the Middle East. The continued provision of unwavering support to our close partner nation, Israel. The continued integration of Israel into the broader region. Resolution of the Israel-Palestinian conflict that delivers peace, security, dignity, justice, and self-determination for all. And the deterrence, containment, and if necessary, confrontation of an Iranian regime that continues to meddle with and undermine the stability of its neighbors, supports violent proxies, partner forces, and terrorist groups, proliferates weapons to enemies of peace and adversaries of democracy and the rules-based order, threatens harm and plots against Americans, and advances the development of a nuclear program toward the creation of an Iranian nuclear weapon, a weapon which Democrats and Republicans agree that Iran must never be allowed to obtain. In the Middle East, the events of the last 11 months have been wrenching, beginning with Hamas's savage attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. Israel is consumed by a conflict against Hamas in Gaza that it did not choose, yielding devastating consequences on millions of civilians. The steady escalation of violence throughout the region by Iran's proxies and partners continues to displace tens of thousands in northern Israel, hold the maritime domain under threat in the Red Sea, and has risked the lives of U.S. service members. Iran continues to methodically advance toward a nuclear weapon through the stockpiling of highly enriched uranium. It has solidified its axis of upheaval with Russia, China, and North Korea, combining their nations' respective resources and competitive strengths to produce and proliferate deadly drones and missiles, evade Western sanctions, and bolster their resilience, all in an effort to dominate their respective regions and undermine the rules-based order, which has allowed the United States and free nations around the world to succeed and prosper since the end of the Second World War. The last 11 months have been a cavalcade of misery, which mercilessly continues and shows few signs of abating. My written testimony includes recommendations for U.S. policy and encourages lawmakers to come together with the executive branch in a good faith effort to reach consensus on a bipartisan approach to advancing U.S. national security objectives. The Middle East is experiencing a geopolitical moment of sustained tension and consequence, which requires unflinching thoughtful, and unified American leadership. Reaching bipartisan consensus on U.S. policy in the region is attainable and very much worth pursuing. My written testimony includes two thematic areas as points of departure to consider for the creation of a bipartisan Middle East strategy to meet the moment: a modified approach to the Israel-Palestinian conflict and a new bipartisan strategy on Iran. In conclusion, let me share that it is customary in Judaism that when someone dies, we mourn them. Typically, Jews mourn for 7 days, commonly known as sitting Shiva. There are mourning rituals that extend 30 days, shloshim. However, when Jews lose a close loved one, like a parent, they mourn for a year, Shnat HaEvel, the year of mourning. For those who lost their loved ones on October 7th, 2023, the end of the year of mourning is approaching. While 1,200 people lost their lives in Hamas's unspeakable crime that day, the past year has only brought continued misery and death for Israelis, Palestinians, and others throughout the region. But soon, the first of the mourners will end their ritual and attempt to move forward. This act serves to remind me that following even the most unimaginable tragedies, there is opportunity for renewal, growth, and a better future. Similarly, in the wake of October 7th, the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, and the regional insecurity enabled by Iran, America's policy and legislative leaders, too, must look forward and seek renewal. Together, you can advance a strategy to secure America's national security in the Middle East and those of our partners and allies. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate y'all very much. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Now I recognize myself, which I always think is an odd thing to say. I'm looking in the mirror. Hey, it's me. Yeah. I'm very good looking. I realize that. Thank you. Miss Fontenrose. Sorry. These glasses, I got to adjust. There was minimal response to Iran's attack on Israel earlier this year. Do you believe that Iran has been deterred from launching another attack?
Mr. Chairman, I absolutely do not. I think that first attack was a test of Israel's air defenses and a test of the network that the U.S. has put in place to help defend Israel and other partners in the region. I think we're definitely looking at a round two of some sort once Iran reassesses, checks the reliability of its weapon stockpiles, since many of them failed during that attack, and they may choose to operate in another way. We could see attacks elsewhere globally. It may not be the same kind of attack, but this is not over.
The economics of that attack were, it's basically sending a quarter over the border and then firing a $10 bill at them. Is that about your assumption of that?
The proportion is probably even worse,
Yeah,
to be honest.
probably worse. Yeah, that's what I thought. Is there a direct correlation, ma'am, between the attacks on Israel and the Biden-Harris administration's lack of oil sanctions enforcement on Iran?
It is understood that the funds that Iran receives from oil transactions are fungible and are often redirected to the IRGC, which does put these funds into attack operations and into funding proxies and arming them with additional weapons.
All right. Mr. Abrams, what role is Iran playing in arming the Houthis?
It's fundamental, Mr. Chairman. They don't have the ability to create any kind of advanced weaponry. For example, ballistic missiles. So it's not true that they could do nothing without Iranian help, but without Iranian money, training, know-how, and actual weaponry, the threat from the Houthis would be minimal.
All right, they're just in those John boats running around chasing big boats, basically.
Yep.
22 rifles, and they've armed them with modern warfare. The Houthis have already attacked Israel, as you know. You think they'll try to do so again?
Yes. The Israelis struck back at Hodeidah, the port, and there's at least some hope that that was a strong enough response to teach the Houthis a lesson. But I think in the passage of time, they'll do it. What concerns me also is they're attacking us, and we have not responded as sharply as the Israelis have.
Okay. How should the U.S. change our policy, put an end to the threat that the Houthis pose?
I'm not sure we can put an end to it in the sense of absolutely nothing else. But above all, I think this wouldn't be happening without Iran. We let the Iranians get away with this without paying a price. To me, that's critical. Iran has to pay a price. If a Houthi missile hits, as Kirsten Fontenrose said, hits an American destroyer and kills Americans, that's because the Iranians gave them that missile. I think we need to make it clear to the Iranians right now, if that ever happens, and we hope and pray it doesn't, the response will be against Iran.
What would that look like? in your
Well, you
opinion?
have a wide range, but if an American ship is hit, you can go from something like hitting, depending on how much damage is on buoys off the coast of Iran. You could hit an Iranian ship. You could hit an Iranian naval base. I mean, there's a wide spectrum. And I think we should be letting the Iranians know right now that will be the response.
What threat do they pose in the next few years if we do not successfully put an end to their actions?
They have the ability over the next few years to build a nuclear weapon. That presumably emboldens them. So with their network of proxies, it's a greater threat to Jordan, which right now they're trying to subvert. It's a greater threat to Israel through the West Bank. It's a greater threat to our allies in the Gulf. And it's a greater threat to the US Navy and to international commerce. It's only going to grow as their oil revenue grows and they get bolder.
Okay, thank you. I've got 20 seconds left, and I'm going to yield that time to my good friend Brad Sherman from California. Mr. Sherman?
We all pray for the health of Joe Wilson, and glad to see he's back on the Hill. We've heard it declared for 5 or 10 years, pounding the table. America says Iran will not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Been around here almost as long as Mr. Abrams. And remember that over 100 times, America said with great determination, North Korea will not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Solemn statements, even by a powerful country, are basically meaningless. With regard to oil sanctions, that means higher prices for Americans, something that I think we should be willing to deal with because our security comes first. But it works only if countries around the world will acquiesce. We don't import any Iranian oil. Can we tell China and India not to import any oil? We were able to do that by threatening to cut off all countries with transactions involving the US dollar. Back just a decade or so ago, the US dollar was absolutely formidable in international transactions. Today, the crypto bros declare they are trying to destroy that power of America. They are partially successful, and they have bought a lot of friends here on Capitol Hill. We renounced the JCPOA in a way that undermines our ability to convince other countries not to buy Iranian oil, even if we pressure them. The Houthis have not just cut off trade to Europe. Food from Russia and Ukraine needs to get to the poorest countries that border the Indian Ocean. Many people are living on 2 meals a day instead of 3 because of what the Houthi have done. The number of deaths that will cause will never be reported, but people living on 2 meals a day die more than those who live on 3 meals a day. These deaths will probably exceed the number who die in Gaza, and blood stains the hands of Houthi supporters around the world, just as the hands of Hezbollah supporters are stained by the over 250 Americans Hezbollah has killed since 1983. Some have asserted Biden has not punished Hamas and Hezbollah. Have you seen the pictures from Gaza? Whose weapons are those? We provided $14.1 billion to Israel, and Israel is doing a pretty good job of punishing Hamas and Hezbollah. The best way not to have a nuclear Iran is not to have an Islamic Republic in Iran. We need to see democracy. Some of the witnesses have said that. The question is, how do we get there? I won't ask for a public question on this because it should be done secretly, but we should be funding every major dissident group everywhere inside and outside Iran that's dedicated to a democratic, non-nuclear Iran. The future of the world may depend upon it, and if we're spending money, we're not spending near enough. We need to provide free internet and use all of our technology to make sure that the great internet wall of China does not extend around Iran. And but I want to shift to another issue, and that is, it said, well, what about the Saudi nuclear program? Ben Salman says he wants the same deal as Iran. Of course, he doesn't. He doesn't want American sanctions and hatred. He just wants the same nuclear program. Now, just because the Saudis are not Shiites does not make them Zionists, but what really concerns me is all the great hardware that we shipped to the Shah was soon in the hands of the Islamic Republic. Mr. Abrams, is Saudi Arabia becoming a nuclear power in the interests of the United States?
Saudi Arabia becoming a nuclear weapon state is
Weapon state, yes.
certainly not in the interests of the United States. Developing a nuclear energy program under a 123 agreement that does not permit enrichment, I think, would be in the interest of the United
And they
States.
should simply follow the same agreement that the UAE entered into with us. They are here lobbying for less control. Why would they want that? Is there any benefit other than the chance to become a nuclear power that Saudi Arabia would get by watering down the 123 agreement model that we signed with the UAE?
Well, there's a problem, which is that we are permitting Iran to enrich uranium. We did that under the JCPOA, and the Saudis then asked, well, if your enemies can do it, how come your friends can't do it?
Well, our enemies get to be our enemies, and we do many bad things to the Iranian government, and we should be doing a lot more. And any funding we provide to dissident groups ought to be done covertly. And I'll point out, if you want to know the weakness of Iran, look at what their government does. Killing dissidents in Europe, trying to kill them in the United States, killing their own people. They're worried. And that tells us their vulnerability. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I now recognize Jim Baird, Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for being here. You know, my first question deals with the Washington Post reported that Iran is pursuing partnerships with 2 Chinese satellite companies, and Iran has previously sought such support from Russian entities. So how would this help Iran expand its capability for remote surveillance, potentially including high-resolution images of military targets? And I'm going to start with Ms. Filipetti.
Thank you, Congressman. So this is part of how Iran is able to project power internationally through its not only nuclear weapons program, which we've been discussing already, but also through its coordination with other powers like Russia and China. In particular, we have seen how Russia has helped amplify the nuclear weapons program that Iran has been producing. And so their coordination with China has also allowed them to evade sanctions quite extensively. So we know that their coordination with both of these powers is intended to antagonize the United States and replace the American-led system. So any additional access they have, particularly coming from Chinese technology, which, as we know, is very sophisticated in terms of its ability to surveil, is deeply problematic. And just to connect this back to the Western Hemisphere component, which is what I always try to bring up, we have seen how China is also trying to establish satellite connections here, not only as it relates to surveillance systems in Cuba, but also over Argentina, which means that if Iran has a connection to Chinese satellites, then they may also have the ability to monitor us here.
Ms. Fontenrose.
I would agree with everything that Ms. Filipetti just said. I would add that One option we also have not considered is that Iran has a lot of commercial availability as well. There are plenty of companies around the world that sell to the Chinese and Russian government and also produce for other markets that are very capable of fairly good, at least low Earth orbit imagery. And surveillance is probably the least of our worries. Once Iran is able to surveil, the next step, if they're actually partnering with Russia and China on a space program, is weaponizing in space.
Mr. Abrams, do you want to add anything to that?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lord, you want to add anything?
I think it's all been quite well covered, but I do think the overriding point I think you'll hear is that to think about Iran in isolation, or even the elements of Iran's malign activities at this point, isn't just going to cut it. Iran's capabilities are made worse and more powerful by its cooperation with Russia, with China, with North Korea, as are its proxies and partners. And from here on out, when we think about Iran's strategy, it implicates our China strategy. It implicates our Russia strategy. These things can't be thought about in isolation anymore. And I hope, as much of a fan as I was of our current national defense strategy, which really racked and stacked these adversaries in a sort of a priority order, I would expect and hope that our next national defense strategy starts to think about them as a combined power and what this axis of upheaval is capable of, and ways that we might work together with our own partners and animating our own partnerships and alliances to really confront, create dilemmas, and challenge the capabilities of these forces combined. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question goes back to you, Ms. Fontenrose. You know, how can we more effectively block the CCP's illicit transfer of dual-use technology to Iran and its proxies?
Congressman, that is the question of the year because we are certainly trying, but many of these components, again, are commercially available. A lot of them are very small and difficult to detect. They are also shipped in small pieces. A lot of it is blueprints, and much of it is transfer of knowledge. So it's in the presence of advisors, for instance, instead of in actual pieces. So we have to hit rat lines. We have to hit free trade zones and look into cargo containers. There's so many things that go into trying to block that transfer. And really what we should be looking at also is financial transactions and just the relationship, the trust, because the less trust they have with each other, the less they will share. So there's also an information operations piece here.
Thank all of you, and I would like to mention that Purdue University has developed a program for making chips. You know, this Chips and Science Act, and they have a program for undergraduates as well as graduates. So that's trying to onshore chip manufacturing. So I've got 3 seconds left, and I yield back.
Thank you for your generosity, Representative Baird. Now I yield to my good friend Jerry Connolly from Virginia. Jerry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. Good to see you, my old friend, Mr. Abrams. Mr. Lord, Mr. Abrams, in his testimony, decried the fact that Iran is now close to developing or producing nuclear weapons. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was there any type of international agreement that would have stopped Iran from producing highly enriched uranium or the plutonium that could be used in such weapons?
As I recall, Mr. Connolly, yes, there was.
What was the name of that agreement?
It was known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA.
And were Russia and China party to that agreement?
They were.
And who led that agreement? Who initiated and helped write that agreement?
The United States.
Oh, it was our agreement.
Yes, sir.
And we had Russia and China, as well as Iran and Europe as
Yes.
members? Oh,
Yes, sir.
wow. As part of that deal, were there steps taken to ensure that Fordo, Natanz, and Iraq facilities pursued only low-level enriched uranium for civilian work, medical work, and industrial research?
Yes, sir.
And did that agreement require Iran, in fact, to ship out of country excess enriched uranium to a third party?
Yes, sir. In fact, it did.
And did that agreement require Iran to close down a plutonium production reactor?
Yes.
Did that agreement limit the number of centrifuges and the kinds of centrifuges that otherwise might be used to produce a nuclear weapon? Did that require Iran to agree to stipulation limiting those centrifuges?
Mr. Connolly, yes, it did require them to agree.
And did the IAE certify 8 times that in fact Iran was in compliance?
Yes, I believe it did.
And did the Trump administration agree with that certification not once but twice in 2017?
To my recollection, yes, it did.
Huh. So when we decry the fact that Iran is now days away, if it wants, to actually produce a nuclear weapon, it is instructive, is it not, to reflect on the fact that we actually had an agreement that was certified, working. And oh, by the way, I should ask one more question, because again, Mr. Abrams complained that Iran is now defying IEA inspections. Were there IAE inspections when the JCPOA was in force?
Yes, sir, there were.
And they were unannounced?
Correct.
Uh-huh. So if we were to renounce that agreement unilaterally, it's a little much to expect IAE inspections in Iran if the agreement is no longer in force. Wouldn't that be a fair statement?
At least those that were a part of the JCPOA.
It's kind of in the category of it can't have it both ways. You can't complain that Iran's close to a nuclear weapons capacity, which I decry, and that's why I supported the JCPOA, because it was the only instrument at hand that actually would push back the nuclear weapons development program in Iran. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, at the time, I think it was the most effective tool.
Mhm. And again, we had IAEA inspections. I know that for a fact because I actually went to Vienna and got briefed on a bipartisan basis by some of the inspectors and their reports. And, you know, I think you have to admit, you tell me if you disagree, the JCPOA, in fact, was working. In fact, against predictions, Iran was complying. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, it is, sir.
And what happened to the JCPOA that was working? And they were in compliance with virtually every metric we set forward in the treaty, in the agreement. What happened to the JCPOA?
Well, the United States withdrew from the deal, sir.
Who did that?
But that was a decision made by President Trump.
President Trump. And now we are where we are. Is that correct?
We are, in fact, where we are.
Well, forgive an editorial opinion, but for those who want to decry Iran's proximity to nuclear weapons development, they have only one person to blame, and that's Donald Trump. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize Rich McCormick from Georgia. Rich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Jerry.
Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Next month marks October 7th, not only my birthday, but obviously an infamous day in history in which Israel was attacked, about 1,200 people slaughtered, 250 people kidnapped, including many Americans. This attack, in my opinion, was made a reality by Iran in support of evil people. We've seen them support Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Russia, China, pretty much every enemy we have, they've supported openly. They've created this unholy axis, which they, as a small country with a very small GDP, has become literally a purveyor of hate and death around the world now. Ms. Fontenrose, it doesn't make the front news anymore, but we've continued to have attacks in the Persian Gulf, mainly from the Houthis. We've seen ships attacked. We've seen a couple of them recently attacked in September, earlier this month. And then September 9th, we shot down another drone. We know that they have these capabilities only because of Iran. The question is, how do we cut off the flow of these weapons from Iran that are going to our enemies, especially the Houthis, particularly in this instance?
Congressman, there is a lot of coordination to happen with some of our partners in the region. Iran uses both water means and land means to do these transfers. We have rat lines crossing some of the countries in the south of the peninsula, and about 6 months of the year when there are not monsoons, you have dhows taking tiny pieces of weapons that are hidden in tiny places into Yemen to arm the Houthis. They also have 3D printers. So, and many of these parts are ordered on
Would it be safe to
Alibaba.
say that it's almost impossible to cut off their supply via routes that basically are endless?
Cutting off the supply of much of this material would be very difficult. Yes, you would.
I agree with you. So
It's better to aim for bigger targets.
there we go. We're setting up the conversation here, aren't we? Mr. Abrams, since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Iran provided Russia with scores of the Shahed suicide drones. Secretary Blinken confirms last week that Iran recently provided Russia with a large new shipment of ballistic missiles that will undoubtedly be used to kill Ukrainian civilians and ultimately to try to win the war for Russia, which basically is an invasion of Europe, which NATO was set out from the very outgo to resist. It's the most germane time of NATO's existence since its creation. So we're at essentially war with an invading, expansionist, tyrannical government into Europe that we formed an alliance to resist. Why has this administration basically stood idle while Iran continues to supply our enemies with something we really can't stop them from doing just by supply lines, as we already said with the Houthis? We're having the same problem with Russia, but on a much different scale and for much different reasons. But why haven't we done anything?
I think that we should be doing much more enforcement of sanctions. The administration says we don't want confrontation and we don't want escalation. I would actually rather that Iran didn't want escalation or confrontation
Bingo.
out of fear of us.
So you served in Reagan's administration, did you not?
Yes.
I'm jealous, by the way. Reagan, I mean, come on. This guy is the guy for me. What do you think Reagan would have done given his history with nations who are probably troublesome, but not even as troublesome as Iran? What kind of response do you think he would have given?
He would have tried to talk them into, negotiate them into stopping, and if it failed, he would have acted. And
He would have acted.
in 1988, he did.
He
Sank half
certainly
their
did.
navy.
And I remember people going, oh my gosh, it's the beginning of the end. These guys are going to come after us. They hate us. Yes, they do. And Muammar Gaddafi, after losing a son, rolled over on his back, showed his belly and said, I want to be friends, because we understand that region and they understand strength. If you show weakness, you give them an inch, they take a mile. And thank you for being of service to such a great president, such a strong president. I saw it during Reagan's administration. I saw it during Trump's administration. When you break out the Moab, the mother of all bombs, when you hit somebody in the jaw that's a bad person, they roll over and they say, I don't want any more of this. And this is the time to act, in my opinion, before they become a nuclear power.
Right.
Are we waiting for Iran to become a nuclear power before we do something? And then, of course, we won't, because we'll be scared to. This is the time to act. Weakness has created war. Weakness creates death. Weakness creates a propagation of this hatred and these propped up enemies that we have. And I think we should hit Iran hard. It really disappoints me the Biden administration has been absolutely inept, weak, and ineffective. With that, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Ms. Manning, ma'am, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing a slice of hee-haw to this hearing. It takes me back to my childhood. So, the threat posed by Iran has been clear for many years, as evident from all of your expert testimony. And we have made wide-ranging efforts to stop Iran's malign behavior. We've imposed sanctions. We've worked with our allies and entered into the JCPOA. As Mr. Connolly so deftly detailed, Donald Trump pulled us out of the JCPOA, and Iran is now closer than ever to becoming a nuclear power. We've asked our allies who remain in the JCPOA to trigger snapbacks. We've worked with Arab allies to create a regional alliance to stand together against Iran. We've moved Israel from European Command to CENTCOM, where they logically should be. And yet, Iran continues to wage its holy war against Israel, against the U.S., against the West, and against its own people. So what should our short, medium, and long-term strategy be to defeat Iran's battle against Israel, against the U.S., against its own people? And I know this could be a 24-hour answer, so I'm going to try to ask each of you to give me a piece of that answer. Mr. Abrams, please address the nuclear issue, because I know you had a lot of questions. You disagreed with the JCPOA. I don't know whether you would agree that maybe we were better once we were in it, not getting out of it, but what should we be doing to address the nuclear issue?
One of the most effective things we could do now, I think, is snap back. I think we should be asking, you mentioned it, the British, French, and Germans to do that. I think that if a new president asks them to do that, they may well be willing to do it. And that would have a real impact.
So we should ask our allies to do what we are no longer really able to do because we got out of the deal.
Correct.
Anything else?
Well, I'd like us to enforce the oil sanctions, because the more funding that regime has, the more harm they can do.
And what should we be doing to address their non-nuclear malign behavior?
Well, we've talked about the Houthis, and I think the U.S. Navy should have a much stronger response in keeping the sea lines of communication open.
That's one instance, but should we have a grand strategy for addressing the non-nuclear malign behavior?
Well, one piece of it, again, this could be 3 hours, but one piece of it, the ultimate solution is a democratic Iran with a different foreign policy. And we should be doing more to help the people of Iran in their struggle against that regime.
Okay, I can't disagree with you, but I'm going to move to Ms. Filipetti on this one, because you address the issue of what we should be doing to help the people. And I guess my question for you is, how should we address Iran's attempt to radicalize people around the globe to spread an anti-Western holy war?
Thank you for the question. So this is one of the most significant threats that I think Iran poses. In addition to its nuclear threat, is the disinformation and propaganda risk that it's posing, both outside the United States, as we see all across the world through, as I laid out, their propaganda outlets, but also inside the United States. So we are constantly seeing them use social media, use TikTok and other outlets in order to promote anti-American propaganda. So we need to figure out how to address the propaganda aspect of this in addition to the nuclear component of it. I would also say that this Congress passed some really important legislation that allows for more human rights related designations against the Iranian regime, like the Masa Act. And I have not seen that the executive branch has yet used those authorities, which I think are critical authorities. So ensuring executive branch compliance with the authorities that this Congress has rightly passed.
So
is
enforce
key.
the laws that we've already passed and be more vigilant in enforcing that. Ms. Fontenrose, like you, I am deeply concerned by the Director of National Intelligence's finding that Tehran has sowed discord here in the U.S., particularly some of the anti-Israel protests that have taken place on college campuses. They have emerged as the leading source of disinformation and a top threat to the security of our elections. So what should we be doing to address that? What consequences should Iran face?
First, we should do something here at home, which is inoculate our own population, make sure they're extremely aware that this is happening. And frankly, this ODNI report is perfect justification for something, as Jonathan mentioned, a bipartisan approach to this kind of conversation. This is something we simply cannot countenance as a country, this kind of meddling. And it's not only Iran, it's other actors as well. So there's really a larger strategy that needs to be looked at here.
Okay, thank you. I wish I had 3 more hours to get your answers to these difficult questions, but my time has expired, and so I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. Gabe Amo. How do you say your last name, Gabe?
Amo.
Amo.
Yes.
All right, brother, I got it.
All right.
Amo.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you regardless. Thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. As we approach the one-year anniversary of October 7th, I reiterate my call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire, one that releases the remaining hostages and surges humanitarian aid into Gaza. I also reaffirm my support for a long-term plan, one that ensures a lasting, peaceful two-state solution and provides self-determination for both Israelis and Palestinians. An immediate ceasefire and comprehensive day-after plan are essential for containing the conflict and countering the threat of Iran and its proxies. Even before October 7th, though, it is clear that Iran has been a destabilizing force in the region, threatening our national security interests and preventing a lasting peace from taking hold. For decades, support for regional proxies has been central to Iranian foreign policy. It has funded armed groups and terrorist organizations, including Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and militias in Iraq and Syria. Iran has reveled in chaos as it seeks to expand influence by carrying out attacks on Israel and United States personnel in the region. The United States considers Iran the foremost state sponsor of terrorism for good reason. After October 7th, we've seen increased activity from Iranian proxies in the region. We need to understand the kind of support that Tehran is providing to prevent future attacks. So I'll start with Mr. Lord, but I certainly welcome other feedback on my query here. How is the United States tracking the support Iran is providing their proxies? And let's project a little bit, but what should we be expecting in the support of proxies as we move along and they continue their campaign of chaos?
Mr. Amo, thank you for the question. We have a pretty capable means of tracking, and there's a pretty good doctrine and history to follow here, where Iran has sought to move sophisticated weapons to these partners, and then over time actually move the capability to create those sophisticated weapons in those partners' own territories. And we've seen that with Hezbollah, who really is the most developed proxy and partner of Iran, certainly the oldest, where it began as the shipment of weapons and capabilities, and then really began to morph into the shipment of the industrial means to build those capabilities in Lebanon's, in Hezbollah's own home turf. So those are the things that we have seen Israel over time really attempt to target most in their campaign between the wars, their meharechet ben hamilchamot, as they call it, mabam, when we get news reports of something blowing up in Syria or in Lebanon or an IRGC Quds Force individual and some others. They're going after the capability that allows Hezbollah to continue to perpetuate conflict. So we have to think very carefully about how we do that ourselves or how we support that with lethal intelligence with our partners. If in fact we ourselves want to engage in that, and I've heard a lot of tough talk here about what we should be doing on Iran, and I think I've said it last year on a Syria hearing. I will say it again. If you are interested in a war with Iran, if you are interested in getting kinetically involved, congratulations, you serve on the one committee in this House that has jurisdiction over war powers. And so if there is to be an authorization of the use of military force, it's going to get marked up here. So if that is something that you believe the president should be doing, it really starts with you here on this committee. So I've talked enough, but I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. And I know I've got limited time, but I do briefly want to speak to the concerns that I expressed in April about the growing ties between Iran and Russia and whether they would continue to share advanced technologies. And we've heard from Secretary Blinken in the past week that, and the Department of Defense, the confirmation that Iran is sending ballistic weapons to Russia to support their illegal invasion of Ukraine. Trade is a two-way street, raising some real concerns that Russia is sharing advanced and even possibly nuclear technology or information with Iran. And so briefly, Mr. Lord, Can you share any concerns that you might have about that transfer of nuclear technology or information between Russia and Iran, and what more can we do to counter this growing relationship?
We are short on time, so I'll be very quick. The stockpiling of uranium is a problem, but the technological deficit that Iran has to actually weaponize is the X mark beyond building the stockpile. That is a gap that Russia could choose to close instantaneously if they felt they needed to, if they needed more arms and support, if Iran wanted to extract something from them. We need to think exactly about this problem and how we create dilemmas for Russia and Iran. And I'll just point to a piece of legislation that came out of the House. I believe it was written by Mr. Trone, sponsored in a bipartisan way by Mr. Scott. Mr. Schneider, I think, was a co-sponsor of this amendment for the NDAA that would actually make it easier for the administration to take weapons that were captured from Iran on the way to the Houthis and then use presidential drawdown authority to send them to our partners in Ukraine to fire back at Russians. And I think those are the types of things we need to be thinking about that this Congress could be helping to do. Unfortunately, that amendment did not make it past Rules Committee here in the House. It may be under consideration in the Senate version of the NDAA, but I would strongly encourage those types of means as a way to think creatively about how we can impose real dilemmas on this axis.
Thank you for your responses. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Now recognize Kwasi Mfume. Did I get that right? Close.
Mr. Chairman, you're in the ballpark. God bless you. You're a great American.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thank you very much. My thanks also to our witnesses today. Mr. Abrams, it's good to see you from way, way, way back, and not through the Wayback Machine, but in terms of working together on a lot of these issues. It was instructive to me when the chairman talked about how, in fact, far back we go on this issue as a Congress. And it occurred to me that as a young member of this body in 1987, it was Ronald Reagan that called myself, John Lewis, Nancy Pelosi, Ben Cardin, and a bunch of us who were part of the freshman class to the White House to get to know us and to have some off-the-record talk, but mostly to reach out. He had been under a lot of criticism from some of us during our campaigns, and so we had a chance to talk there. And one of the things that I remember President Reagan specifically taking pride in was his decision to carry out the Carter administration sanctions against Iran rather than after he got the hostages released, as we know, in January of '81, rather than to go in a different way. And I guess he was trying to signal bipartisanship. One of the things I learned is that there have been a lot of lessons to be learned about Iran over the years. And the poignancy of all of this are the lessons that have not been learned. And one of those lessons is that you can only trust Iran so far. That's the bottom line. And so when we look at what occurred during the Reagan administration, or fast forward to the Bush administration, and in 2005, how that administration decided, because Iran did not want to stop its uranium enrichment, to pretty much sever ties and to start putting in sanctions. And through the Obama years with the green hostages and the things that went along with that, one thing that keeps coming back to me is we, in the absence of a consistent, and I do mean very consistent approach to Iran, we're going to hop, skip, and jump from one administration policy to another, which does not give us credibility, in my mind, in the larger international community, because it becomes, well, we'll see what the American policy is with the next president. And the people who are sowing the bad seeds and are creating the unrest have that luxury to sit back and to wait in a very clandestine manner, do what they were continuing to do all along. And then there's another election, and there's another version of U.S. foreign policy. It just does not bring about the kind of change that we want. So I want to ask all of you a question about our allies in the region. I know we're sharing intelligence, but I don't know how that's taking place. and if the intelligence sharing is in fact something that can be quantified, where we see real results, because this is about our allies in the region and how Iran continues to sow its terror that affects all of us in the larger international community. So, Mr. Elliott, since I've known you the longest, I'm going to begin with you, and we can go down the line. If you would take a short 30-second period to respond, that would be good to everyone.
Thanks, Mr. Mfume. We get a fair amount of intelligence on Iran from Israel, and we get intelligence on Iran also and knowledge from allies outside, because they have something, many of them we don't. They have embassies in Iran. So we get from those embassies, from their ambassadors, much better sense of what's it like, what's going on in there that we actually lack because we don't have an embassy.
Thank you.
Congressman, I interpreted your question slightly differently. I thought you were asking about how we share intelligence with our regional partners, so I'll address that just briefly. And we do have very close intelligence sharing relationships with most of the Gulf countries, with Egypt, with Jordan. They do complain they don't get enough. We are doing some things right now to try to pass more. A lot of the issues are trust within them. We have to serve as a hub because intelligence can't be shared, for instance, with a group of them since they simply don't trust one another. But CENTCOM has done quite a bit through the Integrated Air and Missile Defense construct, or the regional construct they're building to share intelligence. And we've seen the proposed AI Accords Act that will do, have additional steps for intelligence sharing with countries in the region.
Okay.
I'm happy to pass to my co-panelist if he has anything to add.
Good.
You're very kind, Carrie. Thank you. Very little, but just to sort of hop on Kirsten's point, our intelligence sharing with partners has grown tremendously over the past few years. We almost feel a duty to share. The challenge is there is intra-Gulf tension, which reared its head, I think, in 2017, which we saw with the Qatar Rift. But some of these partners trust Israel a lot more than they trust their neighbors for a whole host of reasons. And so if we can think about ways that we can build trust and comity between our partners in the Gulf, that can go a long way to supporting a broader intelligence network, as well as our efforts to build the interoperability regional security architecture that we're seeking.
Thank you. Let me reclaim my time quickly. The key is trust. So each one of you spoke and said the same thing. The problem here is that you never know who trusts who and who's doing something that's clandestine that ultimately undermines that trust. I mean, it's a terrible sphere of operation because it's porous. It's got holes in it. And I'm asking this because I'm really concerned about the safety of our troops, of our intelligence people, our people who are on the ground over there, and ultimately what I've said before, the security of this nation and the security of our allies. So my time is up. Mr. Chair, I want to yield back. I do want to underscore the consistent refrain that we've got to find a way to have a ceasefire, to bring the hostages home, and to have again, consistent foreign policy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back, and I appreciate the extra time.
No, I appreciate you, and I appreciate your little bit of history lesson in the beginning. And you as a freshman, I thought that was pretty cool. I actually visualized that as you were saying that. That was kind of cool.
Long time ago.
Yes, sir. Well, I guess I was a sophomore in high school, if that makes you feel any better.
No, it doesn't.
No, I'm sorry, sir, but you've always been extra kind to me, so I appreciate you very much. Mr. Schneider, I believe, Brad, you're recognized. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member, and also all the panelists for being here today. This has been very helpful and informative. I want to pick up on what Mr. Lord, you said in your opening remarks. I appreciated them talking about the Jewish traditions of mourning, and our tradition is really centered around this idea of zachor, memory. And it's through that we keep generation to generation the spirit alive. We are coming on to the 1-year anniversary of October 7th. Immediately after that is Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish year, where we remember all those who came before us that we have lost. But the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Sukkot, which was connected to the October 7th attacks, is also a time of renewal. And I appreciate your remarks about a vision for peace and security for Israelis, Palestinians, and everyone in the region. I think that's really what we're here talking about at its core. Is there a way, in the way I frame it, of breaking free from the gravity of the history of this region, so much of the history of this region, to create a path to peace, or are we stuck in a cycle of war? And at the core of that cycle of war is Iran, who with support of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, I can go down the list. They are the single largest sponsor of terror and the threat to peace, which is why we are here today. And October 7th, a year ago, was not an isolated incident. It was a pinnacle. The timing was also not by accident. Saudi Arabia and Israel were this close to normalizing relations, and who loses from that most? But it would be Iran and their aspirations for chaos within the region. Iran's role can't be overstated. Tehran has long funded, armed, and trained Hamas and the other terrorist organizations, enabling them to launch attacks on civilians and disrupt the hope for peace. We're currently facing a very real threat of a second front opening in the north against Hezbollah, between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah has 150,000 or more rockets, many of which are precision guided, poised to escalate. We saw this week Israel, in a clandestine attack, detonate the pagers of Hezbollah. Anyone who had one of these was connected to Hezbollah, was a member of a terrorist organization. Well, not everyone, because the ambassador from Iran to Lebanon also had one of these Hezbollah pagers. Why is Iran communicating in a terrorist communication chain with this? And there's tens of thousands, nearly 100,000 people in Israel on the north evacuated from their communities. I met with many of them yesterday. They can't go home because of the threat from Hezbollah. And until we relocate the Radwan fighters away from the border to the north of the Litani River, there's not going to be peace. And we can talk about Iran, and we touched on that, or not Iran, Yemen, and we touched on that. Yemen is a wild card in all of this, because yes, they are being armed and funded by Iran. They also overtook all of Yemen's government's weapons, and they aren't necessarily going to just listen to Iran. In all of these threats, we're left with the threat of a nuclear Iran. And I have questions. I'm looking at the time. I want to get to these questions. But we cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. We've been fighting this or working against this for now more than a generation. And Iran has kept marching forward. Ms. Filipetti, you talked about the anniversaries. It was Iran and Hezbollah who bombed the Marine barracks. It was Iran who bombed the Jewish Community Center in Argentina. I was there for the 30th anniversary. It is Iran that is expanding and building its nuclear stockpiles, but also working to develop all the other aspects to have a nuclear weapon, which threatens the region. And a war with Iran today is nothing compared to what a possible war with Iran would be if they have a nuclear weapon. We cannot allow that to happen. So we have to see a different path forward. And the Abraham Accords are a piece of that. We've talked about that, building on those opportunities. Many of us are part of the Abraham Accords caucus, bicameral, bipartisan. In fact, today we'll have a meeting with the ambassador from Saudi Arabia and a bipartisan group of members from the House to talk about that different vision. My broad question, and everyone's gone long, so I'm going to ask for some indulgence here. I'll start with you, Mr. Abrams. We talk about Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, but we are, for 25 years, we've been trying policies and different tactics. What can we do to make our policies more effective? You touched on some of those earlier. What do we need to do? How can we make Iran understand that the United States are deadly serious, that our allies are deadly serious, and we will take whatever actions necessary?
Thank you. First, I think, as I said before, I think both presidential candidates should say this.
Absolutely.
And particularly, more important, whoever's elected should say it. And I think we should take the military moves that suggest to Iran that we are serious. For example, having the force structure there. Because I think if they think we're really serious, then they may not cross the threshold.
Just go down the line.
Sanctions only work if they are on the books and if they are enforced. So that's certainly a first start. we also have other tools available to us. We don't have to be talking about airstrikes on Iran necessarily. We have lots of cyber tools. We can build human asset tools. There are ways to dismantle programs once they exist, or ways to prevent the acceleration of the program that perhaps won't cause mass casualties.
Thank you, Congressman. I would only add, I agree with both of my co-panelists. I think a lot of this has to do with constraining the resources that Iran has in order to commit acts of terrorism. When you look at the threat again from the Western Hemisphere, we have seen many Iranian spies and terrorists who have attempted to plan for attacks on American soil from their position in Latin America. So that means we need to deny the Iranian regime the resources that it needs in order to fundraise for these attacks. That's why I think, in addition to the 2231 snapback that Mr. Abrams mentioned, it's also important to work with friendly jurisdictions to make sure that they are also sanctioning not only the IRGC, but also Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, other terrorist entities. I also think that we need to look at shifting to a full terrorist designation for the Houthis, given the severity of their attacks on global shipping.
And Mr. Lord, in 2 seconds, because I'm getting the hook here.
Very quickly, sanctions are being enforced, and they are being as effective as they could be. Iran is getting better and more capable at evading those sanctions. Sanctions themselves are a tool, they're not a policy. We need to think much more broadly. Finally, I'll say this president has been very effective in deterrence. I think we had a moment here, we could have seen a repeat of April 13th after Hania was killed. But the presence of 2 carrier strike groups, and not only that, but the messaging about all the stealth capabilities, F-35s, F-22, a guided missile destroyer. These are first strike capabilities. And obviously it's not gonna get talked about publicly, but I'm fairly convinced that Iran was put on notice, and President Biden had his hand on the holster and made it very clear. Deterrence can be effective.
Thank you. I'll close with this, Mr. Chairman. Sanctions are most effective on their first day, and whoever's under sanctions are going to try to get around them. We need to ratchet them up. And I will, last thing say, with the USS Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, among the escort ships was the USS Cole. The irony should not be lost that the ship that Yemen tried to destroy a generation ago was defending the U.S. interests and our allies' interests, including Israel, this summer. And let all know that the United States stands prepared, and that's our committee's responsibility. We will not allow Iran ever to have a nuclear weapon. I yield back.
Thank you for yielding negative time to me. This reminds me of that scene from Godfather where he stands up and says, I have to go chair my own committee now, so I will not be able to listen to any more of this. But the difference is I'm not a United States Senator, and y'all are definitely not mobsters. So I'm going to yield to, other than that, I'm going to yield to Mr. Lawler from New York. And I want to remind him the great power that comes with that gavel, and don't let it go to his head. Thank y'all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. As we've talked about repeatedly, the main way that Iran is funding their terror proxies has been through the illicit oil trade with China. And over the last 3.5 years under Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, the illicit oil trade has increased by over $100 billion. That is what is being used to fund Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other terror networks in the region. And it's what's being used to fund Iran's nuclear program. I have fought to get 2 of my bills, the SHIP Act and the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act, passed through this Congress and signed into law. Both of these bills were included in the supplemental aid package that passed months ago. Regrettably, the administration has failed to act. They have failed to uphold the law. And only a few days ago did the president finally task the Secretary of Treasury and State with these authorities. Secretary Yellen was here before our August recess, and I asked her specifically about the SHIP Act, and you would have thought I was speaking to her in a foreign language. She had no idea what I was talking about. So my question is, how is cutting off Iran's revenue stream from China, where China is purchasing 90% of Iran's petroleum, how do you see that impacting Iran's ability to fund terrorism in the Middle East? Mr. Abrams.
It would be very important to do that. At the end of the Trump administration, Iran had reachable foreign currency assets of about $4 billion. And now it's something like 60 billion. I mean, they've made, as you said, over $100 billion. So denying them these resources, which, I mean, we know what they do with them, their own armed forces and these terror proxies, would have a real impact on the threats we face.
Any other comments?
Congressman, I would only add that during the Trump administration, one of the actions that was taken was specifically designating some of these Chinese companies, including Costco, which is a significant Chinese purchaser of Iranian origin crude. Those sort of sanctions were effective in deterring China from continuing to engage, which is how we got to the $4 billion number in foreign currency reserves. So additional sanctions that target those suppliers and those purchasers, I think, would be very beneficial to our counter-Iran policy.
Nice to see you, Chairman Lawler. As a resident originally of Rensselaer County, makes me proud. Let me just say that your characterization of the Biden administration's actions during this time, I think, are a little bit unfair. I'm not a surrogate or representative of the administration, but I think it's important to note that this administration took some very creative and effective action in closing the dollar auctions in Iraq, which were a massive sieve by which Iran and its proxies were able to gain dollars, as well as Syria, as well as other illicit actors. And as many as 80% of those transactions were sketchy at best. There's a lot of work to be done, but that happened under this administration. I think if you look across the recommendations in our testimonies, there's a lot of shared thinking here. And it's not because I'm a fake Democrat or Carrie or my colleagues are fake Republicans. It's because fundamentally, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, Republicans, Democrats really want the same thing here. The challenge becomes with what you're discussing when it comes to China is this implication of our China policy. When we start sanctioning Chinese entities, we start to implicate the issues and questions around Taiwan, and we get well away from my level of expertise. So I'll leave it there. But I will say that there is a tremendous amount of sanctions busting and evasion, which sanctions is not going to get to because they have de-dollarized these processes.
Look, a broken clock is right twice a day, okay? And yes, the administration has taken some actions that have supported the effort to crack down on Iran. But when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris came in, their objective was to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. And as part of that, they lifted the secondary sanctions that were implemented under the Trump administration to go after the purchasers of Iranian petroleum. Okay. And so by doing that, the illicit oil trade was allowed to resume and thrive. And you have over $100 billion that came in. We've talked in this Congress about the $6 billion in unfrozen funds. That pales in comparison to what was allowed to occur under this illicit oil trade. So the approach to Iran has been wrong. This administration has taken a very wrong tact in trying to go after Iran and its proxy network, which is raining terror across the Middle East, and Hamas, where they get 93% of their budget comes from Iran. So these are fundamental problems that, frankly, this administration has failed miserably to address. And yes, if they take a right step, great, bravo. but they have taken many wrong steps that have created this climate we're dealing with. My time has expired. I now recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from Minnesota, the ranking member, Dean Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just, in response to this last exchange, state my opinion, which is as long as the world relies on petroleum, there will be a flow of dollars to our adversaries. And it's clear that Iran will direct resources to our adversaries at expense to their own population. Their economy is in the worst condition it has been in probably during my lifetime. And I would simply pose that I don't think there is any sanctions regime that can effectively stop that flow. So I'd like to go down, dig a little bit deeper, and try to find solutions. But first, a question about the West Bank. I'm concerned about escalating violence. There have been, I think, 1,350 attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians, a reduced flow of resources to the PA, which is the only source of stability. So let me actually start with you, Mr. Abrams. Do you believe current Israeli policy, as it relates to security policy, economic policy, and otherwise in the West Bank, is accretive to stability and security and also to United States objectives?
I think there's been a real effort, there is a real effort in the last year or two to introduce money and weapons to Jordan and the West Bank by Iran. Real effort to create violence and subversion in both places. And we've seen a diminution in the ability of the Palestinian Authority security forces to control the West Bank. I think the Israelis are actually reacting to that. Now, settler violence is something else. That's unlawful activity, and it should be prevented and it should be punished whenever it occurs. But the background here is a big new Iranian effort in Jordan and the West Bank.
But anything more? What about current Netanyahu policy towards the PA? Do you think this is helpful or not?
I think the Palestinian Authority has, for certainly a decade now, proved itself to be corrupt and incompetent. And I don't think the Netanyahu policy, well, I mean, it does go back more than a decade,
Sure.
but is the problem here. I think the problem is the PA.
And Mr. Lord, your perspective on my questions about current policy, settler violence, and also strategy towards the PA?
Yeah, respectfully, I'll have to disagree a bit with Mr. Abrams on this one. Really, for about the last 20 years, Israel has been operating on a national security paradigm that assesses that this conflict is only manageable and not solvable, coming off of the failures of Camp David in 2000. But unlike previous paradigms of conflict management, this one has been inextricably tinged by an ultra-nationalist ideology, which fundamentally rejects the two-state solution. And we have seen that most prominent, most vocal in this last government led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, where settlement has grown at an extraordinary pace. Settler violence has similarly grown, and the consequences for settler violence have never been lower. And all one need do is look at the overt statements of the ultranationalists in this government who have their fingers on the knobs of this to know that exactly their purpose is trying to destroy the Palestinian Authority and export the chaos we're seeing in Gaza to the West Bank that fundamentally allows them to come in and ultimately annex large swaths of the territory. And I think it's inimical to Israeli security interests.
I appreciate it. I want to move on to the border between Lebanon and Israel. Ms. Fontenrose, do you see any potential, especially in light of what has transpired over the last few days, to enforce Resolution 1701, to actually establish a reasonable buffer zone? And how should we in Congress and how should our allies proceed with reestablishing dynamics for a return for both Lebanese and Israelis that have been displaced?
At the expense of sounding flip, I think the actions of the last 2 days may encourage fighters to move away from that border simply because hospitals are full.
Yeah.
But certainly it was a message sent about the reach of the perpetrator to Hezbollah's rank and file. So they will have much more trouble now conducting command and control. They will have obviously trouble communicating. They will have trouble recruiting. You'll have mothers throwing away anything with a battery in it in their sons' bedrooms and locking them in. We've definitely seen where the network reach goes. And that will give many of the rank and file fighters cause to question whether or not this is an activity they want to engage in. So I think the time for negotiating that is a bit stronger now on Israel's side. It's certainly worth an attempt.
Okay, and back to you, Mr. Lord, on the same question, your perspective on 1701 and the dynamic in the buffer zone.
Immensely difficult. What we've seen in the last few days is some cause for concern. I've been very public in the indicators and warnings that we'll see forces come away from Gaza and start to be repositioned north, likely in advance of a conflict on the northern border. And we're now starting to see that. What we've seen really in just the last 48 hours, 72 hours, I think may be unrelated to that, but may not be. And Israel is trying to use unpredictability and demonstrate ways in which they can come at Hezbollah in unpredictable, unknowable ways from Hezbollah's perspective to make them more compliant and put them in a position of weakness. Because very much right now they feel they are in the driver's seat, and it's leading towards a bad scenario.
Close with one more question, and any of you can respond. As I reflect on post-World War II and the Marshall Plan and how our arch enemies became friends through investment, it's my belief that the human condition will act in the same way when it's oppressed, does not see hope, whether it's Gary, Indiana, or the Gaza Strip. Do you see any analogy between how we handled post-World War II investment in peace and the Middle East? If so, how might that look, a Marshall Plan of sorts for the region? And if not, what are the impediments? And I would welcome perspective from any of you before I close. Not all at the same time. Mr. Abrams.
I would resist the Marshall Plan analogy for one reason, at least, which is that the Marshall Plan countries, for the most part, were industrial democracies. So there you were rebuilding, you were returning. You weren't trying to create something that had never been there before. I think everyone wants ultimately to move to the reconstruction of Gaza. The problem there, I think, is the security side of it, without which it won't work. But the difference, I think, in the Middle East is that there are lots of local resources in the Gulf, but not only in the Gulf. I mean, Lebanon apparently has a fair amount of offshore energy wealth, although it's the kind that you might not like. But and so does Israel, obviously, and so does Egypt. So there are local resources that could be applied.
Okay. Jonathan, maybe, or Ms. Filipetti, anybody to close?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I think there's real opportunity here, but the challenge is getting to the day in between, let alone the day after. Security is going to be hard, but fundamentally, there needs to be a change of understanding in Israel politically about what comes next. If not immediately a two-state solution, and I have a report coming out on this next month, I'm advocating for a bridging paradigm that enables the reconstitution of Palestinian governance and security institutions in concert, that brings in these partners to rebuild and displace Hamas and terrorist organizations, and creates the ability to come forward incrementally. But everyone ultimately needs their goals to align, and we're missing that right now.
I look forward to reading it. Many thanks to each of you, and appreciate your perspectives, and I yield back.
Gentlemen's time has expired. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.